Great. Okay, we are recording. Okay. Hello. Welcome to Sisters Born in Action webinar series. I'm Ayana Young. I wanted to start off by talking about why we're all here. People are awakening to the predicament we find ourselves in as a culture, a political arrangement that doesn't serve us, a mass extinction crisis, climate change, widespread injustice. And we're beginning to mobilize. It's truly exciting to be a part of. Yet in order to make change, we must first educate ourselves. You know, activism is becoming trendy, and education and showing up in a good way is even more paramount. We must comprehend the system and really examine our position and privilege within it, and ask ourselves, what does real solidarity look like? We must show up with humility, integrity, and with an openness to really hear others' voices. So that's what this is all about. I sit here in front of you without all the answers, but with an eager and humble heart, ready to listen and learn in every moment. We'll be diving into some sensitive topics throughout these webinars, and some of the discussions may bring up discomfort or uneasy feelings. I want this to be a safe space for everyone participating, and I encourage you to share your feedback. I'm deeply appreciative of everyone in the audience who is willing to sit with us in this space of discomfort, this space of the unknown, to learn together, to begin to get to the bottom of these systemic issues. Today we're talking with Barbara Jefferson on power, oppression, and intersectionality. Barbara is a Seattle-based queer Black experience designer and facilitator specializing in leadership, collective healing, and community development. She's a lead trainer with Joanna Macy's The Work That Reconnects, with the group Generation Waking Up, and co-host of Black Folks Dinner Seattle, a facilitator of Theater of the Oppressed and Restorative Justice, and the lead trainer of Young Women Empowered. Hello, Barbara. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Ayana. Thank you for having me. And before we begin, I just want to add in that my preferred pronouns are they and them for all those watching and for our interview today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Me too. Me too. So I want to begin by acknowledging the foundations of this country. To acknowledge the white supremacist, hetero-patriarchal capitalist system that dominates in the current paradigm was built upon the blood and backs of enslaved Africans, the genocide of indigenous peoples, the slaughtering of the earth, the suppression of women, and any way of being that does not conform to narrow definitions. The violent and oppressive forces that uphold the power imbalances within the system has not faded in the 21st century. These forces may sometimes be insidious, but they pervade in many forms, such as environmental racism and injustice, urban racial segregation, school-to-prison pipeline and mass incarceration, police brutality, lack of access to healthy food, healthcare, and education, and the list goes on and on. So Barbara, could you begin by defining power? And then secondly, could you share with us some ways you've witnessed oppression enduring in this current day, either from your personal experience or from the communities you've worked with?
Yeah, and as you share, like, so much moves in me as you acknowledge so many different types or foundations of the oppression that we currently see happening. You know, I look up the definition of power, and I appreciate just the good old Webster's definition because it keeps it so simple So simple and straightforward. So to me, and according to Webster, power is considered the ability to do something or act in a particular way, especially as a faculty or quality. So capacity, potential, capabilities, competence, that's all considered power. Also, power is defined as the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. So power is both this intangible sort of quality, and it's an ability, it's the power over, it's a power to influence or determine what happens in the lives of others. And the ways that that happens can be on many different levels. Power can function institutionally. Power can function interpersonally, just between you and I. Power shows up structurally in our society. Power shows up economically. Power also shows up spiritually, right? We all have a power that's greater than us that we can connect to, a power that moves us that we may find through some type of spiritual or religious practice. So power is a very like vast thing. And when we talk about oppression, we're usually talking about power in a way that is a dominating force, power that has been taken from others or appropriated from others and used to then dominate those same people or dominate another people. And for me, I would say that oppression definitely hasn't been squashed. And it just takes on different forms. It takes on different structures that it continues to exist within. And I want to talk about it as dominance, right? Oppression and dominance. Right now, the most basic example that I can use that I'm sure we're all aware of are our policies around immigration. Those, I mean, to be able to put into effect a policy that prevents an entire group of people from coming into this country, from crossing a border, that is a type of power that is oppressing those people. It's oppressing one's human rights. It's denying us many of our civil rights. And that power has been maintained by so few. We can see that with this election, the majority of people in this country voted against our current president, right? But it's not about the majority. Power in this country has always been maintained by the minority. And as we look across society at different types of at our different movements, at our different types of oppression that we see, whether it's racism, Islamophobia, sexism, xenophobia, classism, you know, it's maintained and upheld by a minority. So those are just a couple of kind of basic definitions of both power and oppression.
And how have you experienced oppression? What have you seen as tangible witnesses in the communities that you've been in or worked in? You know, what are some ways that oppression is affecting people?
Well, let's see, let me show you. So according to this same dictionary, right, to oppress is to keep someone in subservience and hardship, especially by the unjust exercise of authority, or to cause someone to feel distressed, anxious, or uncomfortable. I see oppression in almost every direction that I look. As a queer, Black, gender nonconforming female raised in a poor family, here in Seattle, Washington, it's impossible for me to go a day without engaging in some form of oppression. And I think economic the economic injustice and the economic disparity that's happening is one of the most obvious to me. Our capitalist society is set up to benefit very few and to keep the majority subservient, keep the majority living in hardship. Here in Seattle, we have a historically Black neighborhood. Actually, out of my window right now, I can look over at the Central District, which is a neighborhood that I grew up in, my mother grew up in, my grandmother, my great-grandmother. For generations, that was home to Seattle's Black community. And like many other urban cities in America, gentrification has changed not only the inhabitants of that neighborhood, but the culture and the people that it serves. So that neighborhood used to be about 70% African American. Today, it is less than 20% African American. And those folks living in that neighborhood that are people of color, according to some research done recently, about half of them are living on less than $15,000 a year. Right here in one of the most prosperous cities in the United States, in their historically affirming neighborhood, they struggle to have the basic resources that they need. And with gentrification and development comes a higher price for goods and a lack of services that really aim to support those people. So I can see on many levels, economically, and then with the development of the city and where we allocate our resources, with the minimizing of social services to really focus on the most vulnerable populations here, we're leaving a lot of people not only behind, but we're leaving them in some very, very intense hardships. And that's one that I face on a daily basis now that I'm back here in Seattle. And I have watched my community just disappear, literally just disappear. And where we do relocate, it's still in hardship. People are struggling to keep the homes that they worked decades to be able to buy, to be able to try to pull themselves up out of poverty. They're now losing those homes because of this new wave of what some would say the new colonialism.
Thank you for sharing that heartbreak with us. One of the main things I'm hoping to ascertain out of this discussion is to begin laying down the framework of how to make our engagement and activism more intersectional. We have Black Lives Matter, the trans queer liberation movement, indigenous movements focusing on women, yet the same powers oppress all these groups in order to prop up an unstable and short-sighted economy. We're all facing the imminent threat of climate change, the mass extinction crisis, a political arrangement that doesn't represent any of us. But in order to discuss the intersectionality between movements and people, we must first understand positionality. Instead of encouraging watered down definitions of unity, we must be aware that we all come from different positions within this hierarchical society we are born into, which in turn shapes our experience of oppression. So would you mind talking about positionality and some examples in which positionality is disregarded in the movements of today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it's easiest to think of intersectionality as the place at which all of one's identities come together. So I named that I am Black, queer, gender nonconforming, female, recovering Christian, I like to say. And I'm not one of those things more than the other. my experience of Blackness is not the experience of a Black man, it's the experience of a Black female. And that's a very different experience of Blackness in this country. Add to that queerness. My Black female experience is not the same as a straight Black female experience. The types of oppression that I face are not the same as a Black straight female experience. I'm a Black queer female. So the types of oppression that I'm facing are a combination of racism and homophobia and sexism, right? And the types of or the routes to my liberation are going to look very different than the routes to your liberation. The types of services that you need, the types of empowerment that you seek is going to be different than mine. And that doesn't mean that we aren't both looking to dismantle the same system, the same patriarchal, sexist, homophobic system. But if we don't take the time to slow down and recognize the multitude of oppressions, then we are not going to be able to put forth solutions that really bring everybody along. A random example that just comes to mind when it comes to climate change, a lot of cities are doing work to adapt, right? They can see what types of natural disasters are predicted in their area, what types of sea level rise will likely occur. And because of that, they're building infrastructure to adapt to that. Boston is one of those cities. Well, Boston is working on a plan to bring its underground subways above ground, so that commuters will be safe to commute. However, so in the neighborhoods where it's bringing those subways above ground, those are mostly in affluent neighborhoods where taxes can really pay for that. However, in other neighborhoods that are outside of the subway system, or in neighborhoods that are primarily Black and brown and most likely poor, the subway system is not being raised above ground. And in looking at transportation and how to adapt the city to climate change, who are they really looking to serve in their solutions? Are we putting forth the most vulnerable people, those disabled? Are we putting forth solutions for trans people of color? What does transportation look like in the queer community, for example? These are just like questions that don't really get asked. We think transportation, bus, car, let's just put forth solutions that'll likely work for everybody. But we don't slow down to think about who does it actually really serve? What types of challenges are particular populations facing? And in order to answer those questions, we've got to hear from those voices. So getting intentional about an intersectional approach will help us start bringing in the voices that need to be heard, those most marginalized, and also help us tailor solutions so that it's just not one size fits all, but that we have a sense of solidarity that can adapt our solutions to meet each community's needs, and those most vulnerable even within those communities. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I absolutely agree that we have to keep asking ourselves, who does this serve? Are we looking at the full population and not just uplifting the already privileged? And with all of that positionality in mind, could we discuss some steps we could begin in order to cultivate true solidarity and collective allyship between movements? What does solidarity tangibly look like?
Well, it's not something that can happen without real relationships. We have to get to know one another's movements. We have to get to know one another's values. We have to get to know one another's language. We can work together without those things for sure, but real solidarity is proactively understanding what folks outside of your affinity group are really working up, what they're up against. How is oppression showing up for them? What are the policies that are in place? What are the social structures that are in place that they're up against? And what are their strategies? What are the strategies of the Black Lives Matter movement? How can we get to know folks in that movement? How can we build real relationships across our lines of difference, learn one another's language, see where our worlds overlap and where they don't, celebrate those differences, and support the other's strategy? I think a lot of times I may show up with great intentions for my friends in the Muslim community who are going through a lot of hardship right now. We have mosques being burned here in Washington. I may show up to a rally and put together my signs, and I may actually rally a bunch of my friends to make a whole float that's gonna like be a stand for, allyship. And I may come into a space that is not intended for the energy that I'm bringing. And I may have great intentions about it and want to put forth my heart and my signs and bring my community with me. But if I don't first understand the culture and the dynamic of the space that I'm coming into, if I don't first connect with the intentions of that community, if I don't first connect with their goals of their rally or of their vigil, then I may come in and just be basically taking up space with my own agenda. And I think oftentimes we do that. We get really excited about our intentions to show up as good people, but we show up with our own agenda. And many movements don't need us to show up with our own agenda. They need us to come and support. And and I think that that's what real solidarity looks like. It often means being ready to support and let your own agenda go. It also means being ready to do some work to teach yourself what it is that you haven't been taught, what you don't already know about the historical context of the queer movement, what you don't already know about the historical context of indigenous sovereignty. We have to really educate ourselves and build those relationships so that we're not requiring folks from those communities to educate us to do that work, because they're already doing it. They've been doing decades and centuries of emotional labor just trying to survive. We got to show up and bring just as much commitment to our being of service. And that service isn't a passive service, it's a proactive service that definitely includes educating ourselves. So I would say that educational piece is there, building real relationships, getting to know the language of the others that you're seeking to support their agenda, their goals, what they're truly up against, and coming ready to serve and put one's own agenda to the side.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Thank you, Barbara. That was really beautiful and thorough. And I absolutely agree. Building relationships, coming in service, listening, not bringing in one's own agenda, but showing up. And I think also showing up time and time and time again. Even if you do make the mistake by bringing the float the first time, and you learn and you show up again, and you humble yourself to continually be there in the long run. I feel like that's something that is really important to remember, that this is not a quick and easy process. But if we really want to be in solidarity, all of the things you said are of utmost importance. So thank you so much for sharing that.
I want to add another thing to that as well, if I can. Solidarity doesn't just happen when we show up in, for another group. It also requires our internal work within our own affinity group. So if I as a now middle class, in my middle class standing and access to other middle class folks, and really wanting to ensure that I challenge classism because I want to be in solidarity with those who are oppressed by our classist structure, then I need to always be working for that. So within my groups, I can't turn that switch off and at my business, turn a blind eye to the ways that our policies and practices basically work off the backs of those who are poor or disenfranchised and really benefit those who are more wealthy. Yeah, I can't turn a blind eye. I work within the bail bonds industry, actually. I can't turn a blind eye to the ways that bail system keeps poor people in prison and continues to funnel money into affluent communities. That's my industry. That's an industry that I could totally just benefit from for the rest of my life. But within that industry, I have to make change. I have to make change because I'm truly in solidarity with those who are poor and oppressed in my community, those who are economically disadvantaged. So within our own affinity groups, within our own organizations, we have to be doing the work internally to challenge the patriarchy, the sexism, the homophobia, the white supremacy. We have to challenge that within our groups. And I think that that's where the work has to happen most. Great for us to show up in solidarity to someone else's movement. But if we're not challenging the very same racism that they're working to dismantle within our group where we have access and power, then we're not doing our jobs. We're not doing it. So I think that that's actually number one when it comes to solidarity.
Thank you. There's a lot of food for thought there. As we've been discussing, and although the privilege may turn a blind eye, oppression in the form of racism is alive and well in the United States. And the scars of slavery and segregation weren't healed in the civil rights movement. And systemic racism is far-reaching and multidimensional. I'd like to read a quote about Black Lives Matter from Alicia Garza, one of the co-creators of the Black Lives Matter movement. Quote, "When we say Black Lives Matter, we are talking about the ways in which Black people are deprived of our basic human rights and dignity. It is an acknowledgement Black poverty and genocide is state violence. It is an acknowledgement that 1 million Black people are locked in cages in this country. 1/2 of all people in prisons and jails is an act of state violence. It is an acknowledgement that Black women continue to bear the burden of relentless assault on our children and our families, and that assault is an act of state violence. Black, queer, and trans folks bearing unique burden in a heteropatriarchal society that disposes of us like garbage and simultaneously fetishizes us and profits off us is state violence. The fact that 500,000 Black people in the US are undocumented immigrants and relegated to the shadows is state violence. Black folks living with disabilities and different abilities bear the burden of state-sponsored Darwinian experiments that attempt to squeeze us into the boxes of normality defined by white supremacy is state violence. And the fact that the lives of Black people, not all people, exist within these conditions is a consequence of state violence. So, Barbara, I'm wondering, how do you see the civil rights movement of the 1960s compare to the Black Lives Matter movement of our current times? And in which ways have you seen communities suffer most from this state violence?
Mm. You know, I am not an outsider looking in. I'm an insider to the state violence. I live in the midst of it, in my family and in my community. It has impacted me throughout my entire life and all of those closest to me. And I would say that it's hard to weigh one form of it up against another, but I would absolutely say that incarceration and poverty both, the loss of life, murder, all of those, like they're stripping us of our lives, of our dignity, of our power, of our humanity. And it's a constant. You know, in the civil rights movement, what they were able to bring to light through direct action, through public demonstrations, were physical violence. You know, they were able to bring that out to the surface to show everyone in the United States what was happening in these communities throughout the South. But violence isn't just a physical act, just as you could hear from what Alicia Garza wrote. Poverty is a violence that is enacted on a being moment to moment to moment throughout each and every day. And what Martin Luther King Jr. began to do towards the end of his life was shift his focus towards economics, right? Or towards economic equality. And he went up to Chicago and he was working for the poor, right? And so we saw from this very acute, very overt physical violence to the type of violence that is the abandoning of a people. And yeah, like I said, I can't weigh one against the other because I think that they all in the end are killing us. They're all in the end killing us. And incarceration is one way that, you know, racism has been given a new home to live in. But poverty is also a product of that very same racism, you know? And this state violence, this violence is a product of that same racism. It all is coming from that same core that brought us here, that capitalism that brought us here. Racism was a product of a tool to be used in a capitalist system so that we could enslave a people and have free labor. And incarceration has also been that very same thing. Convict leasing allowed for us to, you know, use the loophole in the 13th Amendment to be able to still get that cheap labor. We've now criminalized poverty. We've criminalized mental health. We've criminalized addiction, and we no longer provide the same services that we actually did as a result of the civil rights movement. So the gains of the civil rights movement have been largely dismantled. And our communities are no further ahead than they were then, if you will. There are ways in which there's exceptionalism. You know, we can celebrate that we have people in positions of power that we didn't have back then, but that doesn't mean that our community has more power than it did back then. And it doesn't mean that it has more support either. This violence has become so normalized. It's always been so deeply entrenched in the minds, actually, of white America, that these communities are to be feared, and that fear justifies a type of proactive self-defense that is this violence. It's always been there, and it still is here. And until we find our ways today in 2017 to really bring that to the surface, I think we do that, you know, when we capture things on camera. But until we can really bring that out to the surface, I don't think many of us are going to recognize just how violent this society is on Black and brown bodies.
Thank you for sharing this, something so painful and real and absolutely critical for everyone, and especially those who want to step in to being an ally and understanding, beginning to just understand the ledge of this state violence, because I think for many privileged people, it's easy kind of to stay in the little safe communities and not really understand the depth of this loss of life that's happening so frequently. And from what I understand, thankfully, much of your work, you know, with the work that Reconnects and the Black Folks Dinner Seattle, the Theater of the Oppressed, etc., facilitates community healing. And I'd love if you could tell us why opening up to the grief is mandatory in order to move forward as empowered communities.
Yeah. Well, it was James Baldwin that said, like, you know, I think one reason that people stay so damn angry is because, or so hateful, is that once they deal with the hate, then they're going to have to face the pain. And pain unfaced manifests itself in very dangerous ways. And for me, the pain of being alive in this body at this time, given our history and our current climate, that pain unchecked for me results in a complete debilitation and an almost violent response to the world. You know, like it becomes a type of deep, sour, bitter hatred. And that pain puts many of us in my community in our graves very early on. It's a stressful, nagging heartbreak. It's a powerlessness that can keep many of us from bringing the power and the medicine and the magic and the leadership and the empowerment that we need, you know, the dignity that we need. It pulls us out of the communities that depend on us. So for me, holding space to honor pain is absolutely essential. It's as essential to all political work that's happening as well. Because if we as a people don't address the poison that we're left with as a result of what's inflicted on us, then we can't, we're left with a fragmented self and fragmented communities that then retaliate on one another. You know, we take violence out on one another. And by bringing people together to hold space for not only just like the day-to-day kind of grief that we have when we read the news, or even as we're here on this webinar, we're talking about these things that are heavy, that kind of stir up some pain in us. Beyond that, there's like historical trauma deep in our bodies. There's ancestral trauma that's passed down from us to us from generations who've been going through this, who've had this pain inflicted on their bodies, who've had this violence inflicted on their bodies. And there's compound that is just the layered grief upon grief that we have just being alive, just simply being alive and paying attention. And by coming together and honoring that pain, we allow ourselves to not be afraid of it. You know, in that James Baldwin quote, what I got out of that is that people stay hateful because they're afraid of their pain. They're afraid to face the pain. And more than that, I mean, in addition to that, I think people are also really afraid to face their guilt, really afraid to face the parts of them that have totally benefited from the pain that is going on in other communities, that have totally been perpetuating these very systems that are killing us. I think we're terrified to be honest about a lot of what we feel. And I think speaking the truth and honoring the truth is one, you know, really important step for us to reclaim our power, to not let that grief and that pain and that guilt have so much power over us, but to build a relationship with it where we can honor it and say that it's here because we're human. It's here because we're human. It's here because we love, we care, you know, and we can find new motivation and new wisdom in that. I'm in a particular, my father is passing away. He's been sick for a year and he just is on hospice now. And in the beginning of the year, I ran from the grief. Oh man, I ran from the grief. I tried to stay busy. I was active. I was traveling as much as possible. And that grief just grew. It grew and it made me so hard. It made me so hard. And if you can imagine that, like, decades of grief building up in bodies it turns us into something else. It can make it impossible for us to even show up to a vigil, show up to an organizing meeting, because we can't even handle anymore. We can't even be reminded of that grief that's in us, you know? And I know through my own experience that honoring that grief, really taking time to face it, to be with it, to express it, lets it out, lets it go somewhere, and creates space for me to be present to whatever is happening, you know, and to show up with my fullest self. So, yeah, I think it's a powerful step in our work, and I think it's a really important one. And you know, they always say, like, families that eat together stay together, or families that play together. So I think communities that grieve together, like, build together. I think that it brings us closer when we can see one another's pain. You know, when we can really open our hearts to one another's grief, there's something that happens where we become protective of one another from that place. You know, we become bonded not only in our passions and in our compassion, but in our grief too. And we're no longer afraid of one another's grief. You know, we're no longer afraid to see what really is happening in Black and Brown communities. We're no longer afraid to see what's really happening to queer and trans Black people. who are being assaulted on the street. We're no longer afraid to face it, you know, because that's our family. Those are our relatives. When we grieve together, we feel those familial places, those bonds that have been separated through this colonial system, this post-colonial system. So yeah, grief I could talk about forever. And with the types of violence that I think Alicia spoke about, you know, you can only imagine the type of pain and grief that lives in those bodies. You know, and I think it's important that we create spaces for that healing to happen.
Wow, Barbara. Chilling in an incredibly open way. And thank you for sharing your thoughts on this and how it's connecting and mandatory to move forward, and what happens in the intergenerational trauma when we hold that grief over hundreds, if not thousands of years, and what that does to a person to completely shut them off from stepping into their full self. And as leaders, as passionate people living fully, how that can completely just shut a whole community down, a whole group of people, an individual, everything. And thank you for just sharing. I'm just going to turn on a little light as it's getting dark on the mountain here. So yeah, thank you so much for that. And I'd like to move on to our next topic, which is gender, and the hierarchical and hegemonic structures that dictate our current socio-political arrangement feed off the successful separation of different groups of people. You know, being born into this situation, it's hard to work to break out of our conditioning, and I think many good-willed people struggle to understand realities that are vastly different from their own. Yet it's absolutely crucial that we do so in order to collectively take part in the great turning that's upon us. While each individual's experience is their own, and one can never fully know what it means to live somebody else's life, I think we need to cultivate spaces where we can share our unique perspectives with open hearts and minds. And one of those perspectives that a large portion of the public is learning about at the moment is non-binary gender. And I'm wondering if you could give us a framework and explain the spectrum of non-binary gender.
Yeah, definitely. There's an image that I sometimes use that is the gender unicorn, and you know, it's a simple way of just beginning to tease out some of the distinctions that I think are important in understanding gender. So we are born into this world in this human body, and we come out of our parents' body, and immediately, most often, a doctor sees us, determines our sex. Maybe this happens even before we're born, often actually, determines our sex. And our sex then determines our gender. So they'll say, okay, well, the sex of this child is female. Here's your baby girl. Yeah. Mm. And that is what we call cisgender. Cisgender means that your gender is the same as that which you were assigned at birth. Right? And our sexuality is something different than that. Our sexuality has to do with who we love, not our body. And then our gender identity, however, different than our sex, is how we see ourselves, how we identify our own gender, aside from how it was assigned at birth. So when people talk about the gender spectrum, or when most people, or when I fill out an application, it usually will say gender, woman, man. I only get 2 options. And those 2 options are the either end of this binary. And some people see it as this linear binary of man and woman. And then, maybe there's some people who are somewhere in between, or who jump from one side to the other, who transition from one side to the other. And this is actually a little bit problematic to think about this way. I think a spectrum is a great place to start, to just get us thinking that there's more than just the 2 ends. There's everything in between. But what that limits us to is the mixing of man and woman. If we think that there's only this binary, this opposing man and woman, then our minds are only limited to what we can see that exists along that spectrum. But what about what exists beyond it? What about what exists without it? So within many different communities, people identify in an infinite number of ways when it comes to gender. There are communities where gender does not exist. There are indigenous communities. I'm trying to remember the name of the people in Alaska. They've been there for tens of thousands of years, and they don't have, gender is not a part of their culture or their language. They don't have a word for he or she. So it's widely known and accepted, people who are considered gender neutral. That's basically to be without gender or agender. They don't identify as man or woman or anything in between. Then there's also folks who identify maybe as gender fluid. They feel that at any given time, day, month, maybe years, they flow in between genders. There's others who identify as gender queer. But all of these are considered gender non-conforming. They don't conform to the normalized ideas of gender as man and woman. And I think a basic way to understand one's gender is to start by what was I assigned at birth? For me, I was assigned as a girl at birth. How I identify now, I identify as gender neutral. So I'm a non-binary female. My sex in my body is female, but my gender and how I see myself and express myself is gender neutral. These are not the only genders, though. There are many, many different ways that one may identify themselves. And I think that we haven't grown very accustomed outside of the queer community to slowing down enough to really even ask or even assume that someone may not identify in this binary. Or I think as people in the public eye are accepted more and more as trans, I think as more trans people are accepted by the public eye, I should say, I think folks are beginning to have more acceptance around that. But trans is a large umbrella that encompasses most anyone who has a gender that has transitioned from what they were assigned at birth. So in embracing the trans community, it's also good for one to educate themselves on, what does it mean to be trans? I think it's really good to also spend some time online and just research gender identity, gender language, gender non-conforming, and just see what's out there, because people represent themselves in very different ways. There's no one kind of stereotypical gender non-conforming person or non-binary or genderqueer. There's no one representation of that. So I think that it's good for us to reach out and find stories and faces and images and information that can help us start to build on this concept. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
I think also one other thing is really important in the women's movement right now, right? We use that word woman. And coming back to one of my original questions of who does this serve and who does this not serve? I think that that's one really big question that we should ask all of us who are involved in any women's movement work is, are we inclusive of, like, what about the rest of the identities that are oppressed by patriarchy?
Right.
What about trans women? What about transgender non-conforming people? Who is it that we're really wanting to lift up here? So I think an understanding of gender is really, really important within our women's movement, so that we're bringing, once again, those voices to the table, we're bringing those needs to the table, solutions that really actually tackle everyone's particular circumstances, and in an equitable way. So yeah, I think gender's, an understanding of it is really crucial right
now. Well, goodness, when you were talking about the women's movement, I mean, that's where my mind went to, and who does it serve? Because, you know, so much of the women's movement is saying women have been disregarded in many ways by patriarchy. They don't have power in the same ways. They're not looked at with respect. They don't, you know, just all of these different equalities are taken away. But also, who does the Women's March serve that just happened in DC? You know, and with Trump's presidency, there's been this like fire that's been built up with among a lot of women, which is beautiful. But you have to ask if you're really truly looking at it from you know, a place of integrity. Who is this serving? And you know, we had a conversation earlier. Is it serving a non-English speaking Muslim worker who a Muslim domestic worker? Is that who the Women's March was serving, or the women's movement is serving for that matter? So, you know, looking at genders, looking at positionality, looking at all of these different focuses, if we, with the women's movement, really trying to dissect it so that it can be inclusive. Because, I mean, the women's movement is about uplifting voices of people who have been shut down for so long. So if the women's movement is then shutting down other voices, then we're not getting anywhere. And we're actually just kind of climbing up the ladder so that more people are below than the women's movement. And, you know, that's not what, I don't think that's what anybody, or I hope that's not what anybody wants. And, you know, I'd like to bring up that these webinars stem from our national vision, Sisters Bonded in Action, in which local groups of women and LGBTQIA communities will engage in sacred earth activism and social justice. And, you know, sisters is in the name, but the vision is inclusive. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how women who are in resistance to the patriarchal powers that be, and, you know, stepping into this unapologetic and empowered womanhood, but how can they stand in earnest solidarity with those who identify neither as men nor women?
Well, I think the first way to stand in solidarity is to build that relationship. And that relationship might be an intellectual relationship. It might be simply based on information in the beginning, watching videos to learn more about other identities. There are a lot of resources out there, but there are also a lot of other movements. And there are, I mean, most of the I don't want to say up and coming, but most of the very active organizers that I know are queer, trans people of color. A lot of movements are largely led by queer and trans people of color whose names don't necessarily, make it out there, whose stories don't necessarily make it very far or into like a mainstream narrative, but who are working nonetheless. And we as in queer and trans folks, who activists, we are overlooked. We are not brought into positions of power enough. And I don't just mean brought into a meeting, but I mean brought into real leadership within the organizations that have power and resources and the ability to influence.
Absolutely.
And I think that that's one way that we have to bring equity. We really have to look at not just the system of patriarchy, but how is patriarchy also engaging and interacting with racism? How is patriarchy also engaging and interacting with classism? It doesn't exist on its own. It's held up. It's interrelated. It's systemic. And if our movement is not addressing patriarchy at the intersection of race and class, or patriarchy at the intersection of ability and nationality, then our movement is most likely only serving those most privileged within it. So coming back, I think full circle to the beginning of our conversation, it's an intersectional lens that we've got to always wear. It's relationships and proactive effort to educate ourselves that can begin to build those bridges, and the equity that is going to make our movements sustainable and not just a replay of what the women's movement was in the past. That's going to be some real transformation within the movement, some real work to reestablish values that are not only inclusive, meaning, everybody's welcome to be there, but are really affirming of those bodies that are most vulnerable, that's really empowering of those people who are historically marginalized and left behind. And we've got to do our work to know who those folks are, and we've got to do our internal work so that we don't get in the way of that transformation occurring.
Yes, absolutely. And, thank you for bringing up that many of the organizers that are devoting and dedicating their lives to the betterment of all species of the entire world are overlooked. And what I thought about was the climate movement and the environmental movement. And although people of color and marginalized communities, poor communities, are the most affected, they're not the ones who are the executive directors of the largest environmental organizations that get all the funding. So, the people that are in Louisiana, you could really pick anywhere. They're not only not getting the funding, they don't even have a seat at the table most of the time, even though it's them who are the ones who are living there and actually being affected by rising sea levels or oil extraction, pollution, and on and on and on. So I think it's absolutely critical that we, like you said, do the internal work and do the external work of being able to uplift the voices that actually know what's happening on the ground, and so that because the system can't be changed if we keep compartmentalizing and not giving honor and respect and space. And you've said a few times, slowing down enough to even begin to understand and begin to open our hearts to all of these ways of being and all of these different people who are expressing themselves in this world, instead of just rushing through and not even seeing that that's a form of existence. So thank you so much for taking us through all these different topics, and I would love to open it up to the viewers and the audience with their questions. If there's anyone who, it looks like there is one question. Yeah, let's, so if anyone is open to stepping up and sharing something that's been on their mind during this, even a fear, a question, maybe if you were interested in kind of getting some more intricacies of some of the topics that we have been speaking of, please write in. And while everybody's kind of maybe taking a moment to think about that, there's another question that I've been wanting to ask you, Barbara, just wanting to give some people some space to write in. And so one of the questions that has been on my mind is about youth, and both of the organizations that you're a lead trainer within, Generation Waking Up and the Young Women Empowered, are focused on youth. And, I think about a lot that the world that children are currently growing up in is a much different world than the baby boomers grew up in. Whether it be difficulty of getting a job, the constant inundation of the media, the threats of peak water, peak oil, peak soil. And, the youth of today were born into a world of great challenges, yet more information is at their fingertips, with the internet and iPhone. So I'm wondering how youth are reacting to all of this, particularly youth from marginalized communities.
There's so many different reactions. I think, as with everyone else in society, some people have been given or taught tools to, maybe through education, to really be able to critically analyze what's happening, to think critically, to objectively, to find ways of engaging in solutions, to find outlets, maybe through poetry or art or activism. Young people are in that same place. Some of them are already equipped in their teenage years with these tools and with this access and with these outlets, and many are not. And there is a deep, hopeless powerlessness in youth that is really socialized, is really like just fed into them from such a young age through school and through in their families. But young people are brilliant. I mean, I think each and every one of us as this human organism, we are just a brilliant existence, and we're capable of so much more than we're often given the opportunity to even explore. And what I find with a lot of young people is that once they are given some of those tools, even just a couple of tools to be able to understand what's happening, given the history lessons, given some critical thinking tools, it makes sense. It makes sense. And they're still so in touch with what they believe is right. They don't have these other incentives to turn it off. They don't have the salary. They don't have the social status that they've worked on for decades. They don't have as much to lose. Mm-hmm. So they're still so in touch with what is genuinely felt to be morally right, that humanity that they're not willing to sacrifice. They're not willing to compromise. And they still are willing to take risks. They're willing to take huge risks, which is why I think we see a lot of young people at the forefront of our movements, because they're not afraid to risk thinking differently. They're not afraid to risk even their bodies at times, you know, and they've got so much energy, but it's, I mean, some people show up with a lot more trauma because they're living at the epicenter of what we're talking about. And they don't necessarily have that capacity to engage at the front lines, or the language to sit at the table and really be able to communicate all that it is that they know, that they are experts in. But with work, with support, with tools, young people bring so much. And I think for us in our movements, we've got to learn how to meet people where they're at. We've really got to learn how to meet young people where they're at, and really understand what they need in order to bring the solutions. I think each and every one of us is capable of bringing the solutions that are needed in our own communities. I don't think any of us need someone from outside in another community to design and implement solutions. And young people are the same. I think they need the tools, they need the resources, they need the respect, they need the power, and they can create things. I mean, they're doing incredible work. Young people all around this country are doing incredible work. So it's an exciting group to work with because of that fierce, unapologetic passion and brilliance.
Your work is so far-reaching and multidimensional, and the way you've been able to learn and process and grieve and educate others is such a gift, Barbara. Thank you so much for your dedication to life itself. And I really just appreciate how you're able to share these deep, gnawing thoughts and topics. So thank you. And I'd like to just, want to open up the floor to you, and just, however you'd like to end this conversation, what you'd like to share directly to the audience from what you're feeling at this moment. And if somebody wants to contact you or learn more about all of the facilitations that you are doing all the time, and people may want to be involved with that and learn more from you. So please, floor is yours.
Yeah, well, I did see a couple of questions too, and so I want to just touch on those briefly. And I have a feeling that they will bring us to the close. So one said, this was, well, I won't say your name just in case you don't want me to say your name, but it says, wow, say more about new colonialism. That really took me somewhere. So, well, I think we could all probably say something about new colonialism. If we just think about what old colonialism was, what were some of its mechanisms, what was the driving force behind it, and we look at our current situation, if we look at gentrification as one aspect of it, current development, what do you see as similarities? What do you see as similarities when it comes to land? How does one community possess land? How does one community experience displacement? At the hands of who? Why? What is the economic force driving that? Who is considered valuable and for what reason? So I think we can all answer those questions and just look at, colonialism in its historical context, and then look at things that you see happening today and look for those similarities. There's not much difference. I can say that much. There's not a ton of difference. No. So yeah, I empower you to find more of those connections and how they exist in your own world as well. The next one is, I agree that we must not depend on oppressed people to explain their movement, and that I must strive to do my research. However, firsthand conversations seem so vital. Do you have any recommendations on how to engage on a personal level with people outside our affinity group? Number one thing, consent. And I know this from personal experience and from stories from a lot of other people. Sometimes people are willing to have conversations and sometimes they're not. And I think when we get really eager and we're committed and like we want to have this conversation because this is going to help us build on that like allyship that we're finally here and ready to, and then someone doesn't want to have a conversation and doesn't want to tell us about all the pain that they've been through, we kind of get offended about that and feel in some ways entitled because of our allyship to their story. And we're not. Yeah, we're definitely not entitled to that story. So consent is one piece, you know, and I've learned the most through one-on-one conversations. And I absolutely agree with you. I think that is where a lot of it's going to happen. But one person cannot represent that entire group, that entire experience of oppression. So even with that one-on-one conversation, you're probably not going to get the depth of systemic, structural, institutional law, like policy knowledge that you really need in order to understand that particular issue. So with or without the conversation, there's still a lot of work and reading and educating of oneself to happen. And I empower you and really encourage you to have those conversations and just make sure that, you know, see where you're coming from. Are you coming because you're wanting to extract something from someone's story? Or is it a reciprocal thing? Are you also in it to build a mutual relationship? Or is it just about your agenda of your allyship? First, check yourself there, you know, and just make sure you're coming to it from a sincere place of wanting to build a real relationship with that person and not just take their story and use that for your own growth. Okay. And with that, I would say that, you know, I'm also just one person. My experience is unique to me. My perspective is unique to me. And there are a lot of other people who may inhabit similar identities of mine and have a very different perspective and very different outlook on all of this. And I want to, you know, clarify that I'm not here to represent all queer folks or all females or all Black folks or all gender nonconforming folks. I'm here to just speak my truth. And I hope that in this hour and a half that we've been together, that in some ways, some piece of that is has left you with something to think about, something to work on, some piece of inspiration or opening or new understanding. I hope something beneficial has come out of it. I know for me, in getting the opportunity to do this, I gain a lot of confidence about speaking the truth. I also get the experience of this type of solidarity, of like experiencing what it's like for us to really be in relationship with one another across distance and space and time. You know, this is a beautiful opportunity to do exactly what it is that I feel is needed right now. So thank you all for showing up and being here and listening. And thank you, Ayana, for the invitation to, you know, bring my voice and my perspective. And thank you for your very insightful and, powerful, profound questions and your insight as well. Thank you for putting this all together. I think I want to wrap up by saying the ecologically sustainable and socially, economically, racially just society that we all believe is possible, the life-affirming society that we all believe is possible, is waiting for each and every one of us each and every one of us. And it takes each and every one of us. And we've all got to do our part. And those who are holding bearing the weight of the pain, those who are bearing the burden most heaviest, they've been doing their part without ever consenting to it. And we owe all of them, we owe it to them to get into the game 250% and nothing less, nothing less. So thanks for showing up today. May this be the beginning of 250 uncomfortable, hard, rewarding percent effort today, every day.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And Barbara, you have a workshop coming up on intersectional climate justice in Portland.
Yeah,
so
please
share about that.
In Portland, actually, maybe what I'll do is send you a link that I can post for everyone who is here tonight. But this Saturday in Portland, we'll be doing an all-day radical resistance workshop. It's all about intersectional climate change and radical responsibility. It's an all-day workshop. We're almost full, so I will send that link to you so you can sign up immediately if you are going to be in town. I'm not sure if we're going to videotape it. I hope we will, and if we do, then I'll have a copy of that I would be happy to share with everyone who is here in this webinar today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Barbara. Again, I have learned so much from this conversation, and I can't wait to re-listen again and really let it sink in, all the wisdoms you've shared. And I also just want to thank the Spirit Weavers Gathering for helping put this on. And next week we are doing another webinar with Jade Begay and Lila June on reclaiming and decolonizing indigeneity. So please tune into that as well. And I hope everyone can take a moment after this webinar, and hopefully you don't have to rush anywhere, and you can just kind of sit and take this in, because we've just covered a lot, and I don't think it's all going to settle in at once, but maybe just give yourself a moment to sit in yourself and really give yourself that respect of time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Barbara, and until next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye.